Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be looking at Game 7 from the 2014 World Chess Championship. Give you a quick recap. Magnus Carlsen is up a game. The last game, in game number 6, there were two big blunders. Magnus Carlsen had a monumental mistake moving his king to d2, but Vishy Anand responded with a blunder as well. Magnus Carlsen took advantage of that second blunder and went on to secure victory and go up a full point. So we're halfway through. There are 12 total games. We've gone through 6. Magnus Carlsen is up a full point on Vishy Anand, so one win in front of him. Going into Game 7, Magnus Carlsen actually plays the white twice in a row, and then they'll alternate through the end. Vishy Anand will end on the white pieces. So Magnus Carlsen gets us started in game number 7 with the white pieces. We see Magnus start out with pawn to e4, which we've seen before. Vishy Anand usually opting for that pawn to d4. Magnus Carlsen, a little bit more of an aggressive player, especially in the opening pawn to e4. Pawn to e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. This is the Ruy Lopez. Very similar opening to what we've seen before. Both sides, you can really tell the different openings that they've studied, that they prepared for. This is definitely one of those. Vishy Anand, specifically, the Berlin defense, we've already seen this before, and we talked about in the previous video, but Magnus Carlsen knows the Berlin defense maybe better than anyone, so always interesting to see Vishy Anand play the Berlin defense against a master of this opening, but again, you can really tell that Vishy Anand has prepared for this defense. There's many different variations, many different famous games that have played different types of Berlin defense, so he can study all those and be very, very well prepared. Magnus Carlsen decides to go for castling, and then we see the knight taking on e4. Yes, black does gain material, but it's going to be hard for him to hold on to that material. We do see pawn here to d4, and now the knight's going to come back here, and after the bishop exchange, now we're going to see this pawn taking here on e5, getting that material back. Now the knight comes back here to f5, and the next move was pretty interesting. Magnus Carlsen had two different options. He could bring his queen to e2. He could also bring his queen to d8, and he opted to go ahead and for the exchange. Now, I think he did this, previously he had exchanged the queens off the board, and things went well for him. He ended up with his minor pieces and his rooks going on for the victory. So I think that's probably why he did it. Maybe if that hadn't happened, he would have tried to keep his queen on board, try for a queen to e2, which is completely fine. Still tries to hold on to this semi-open file with this pawn pressure on the e file. But again, I think he kind of looked in the past and said it would be a little bit easier game for me. I'm better at the end game than probably in the world, so he just decided to go ahead and exchange on d8. h3, the king coming back here to e8, doesn't want to be on this open file for Magnus Carlsen to continue to attack. Knight to c3, continuing development. Pawn to h5, Vishy Anand doesn't want to have to worry about Magnus Carlsen pushing up too forward on the king side. And again, when your opponent's queens are off the board, you don't have to worry too much about king safety. A lot of times you'll even get your king involved into the game, centralizing that king, moving more towards the end game. And so he's not too worried about the fact that he can't move his king. And so, okay, doesn't have to worry too much about his pawns not doing anything and staying at home. They can be pretty aggressive. So pawn to h5, bishop here to f4, completing development from Magnus Carlsen. Bishop to e7, rook over here to d1. Again, rooks always do better on open files and semi-open files. They can just control more space. It's not about the pieces you have. It's about what they're doing for your game. And so you always want to optimize the pieces on board. That's why knights usually do better in the middle of the board. They have more squares to go to. Rooks are always going to do better in these semi-open and open files. Also behind kind of your pawns as you kind of push those forward. So bishop here to e6, and then knight here to g5, kind of getting to the home of the king side for black here. But what's interesting is this opening has been played many times by high-level players. Earlier this year, Anish Giri actually played this exact line, and Vishy Anand actually played a very similar line just a few years ago against Nakamura. So both of these players are very familiar with these lines, and they're actually playing extremely fast through the first 25 moves, which we're not there yet. Vishy Anand took only 30 minutes, and Magnus Carlsen took about 20 minutes. So they're definitely flying through these moves. That's pretty fast for 25 minutes in a high-level match like this. So a rook here to h6, not really deviating from much of the lines that we've seen from the Anishjiri game not too long ago this year. We now see pawn here to a g3. The bishop's now going to come down on g5 and take. Now we do see an exchange off the board. The rook here to g6, and then pawn pushing forward to h4. A little bit of protection on that bishop right there. Pawn here to f6. We do see an exchange right here, and then the bishop's forced to come back here to f4. The knight's now going to take. The pawn pushes forward. Can't take this knight because, again, this rook is pinning down the pawn to this king. The rook's going to swing over here. The king's going to come up here to f2, centralizing a little bit. Also just doesn't want to have to deal with the pawn being pinned down, so now he can take if he wants to. First, Vishy Anand decides he wants to go ahead and exchange off the board, and now the knight's going to come back here to f5 since it was being attacked, and adding another layer of attack on the square here on g3. So the rook's going to swing over here to h1, attacking that pawn, and now the bishop's going to take over here on a1, just signifying that, you know, Magnus Carlsen can go ahead and take this material. So they're just kind of trading blows back and forth right now. Now the bishop's going to come back here to e6. The pawn comes up here to a g4, threatening this knight. The knight's going to come back here to d6. And all of a sudden we see the first 25 moves. So Magnus Carlsen plays rook to h7. And this is the exact opening that we see from Anishjiri earlier in the year. And it's crazy that these players study so many games to the level of detail that they remember the first 25 moves in a game, and they can go through them very, very quickly. You know, every now and then making sure that they're not missing anything. But this is the same setup as before. Now, in that game, the play was pawn here to f5. A pretty aggressive line. White then continued with pawn here to g5 instead of taking that. But the first novelty in this opening is what Vishy Anand decided to play. And in the opening, he played a knight here to f7. So this is, you know, he took a lot of time on this move. He kind of made the decision that, okay, now is going to be the time where I kind of go away and I kind of get into my preparation for this specific line. And so Magnus Carlsen, even on his next move, actually took a lot more time than he had for any of his previous moves because he realized, okay, we're kind of going into, you know, uncharted territory. I need to make sure that I'm as prepared going into this battle because it looks like Vishy Anand is playing this new knight to f7 move. We now see the knight come up here to e3, centralizing, just getting more involved into the game right here. King over there to d8, knight to f5, pawn here to c5, knight over here to g3. And Magnus Carlsen's really trying to find any sort of weakness in Vishy Anand's setup. So this pawn right here on f6 is definitely something that he can attack. So we could see the knight come over here to h5. And then after h5, this bishop would come down here to g3 and then h4. And then all of a sudden they have two minor pieces attacking the square here on f6. So again, there's not a lot that either side can really do right now. They're somewhat at a stalemate, just waiting for someone to slip up or find a small advantage. And so that's what Magnus Carlsen's deciding to do. He sees a small little opening, and so he starts to go for it. Vishy Anand thought about it for a while and then played knight here to e5. This does put a little stop to it. You now aren't going to see knight to h5 because now the bishop can come up here to g8 where it couldn't before. And this just adds some pressure on Magnus Carlsen that he doesn't want to have. And so instead of playing that, decides to go ahead and bring his rook up here to h8. This checks the king, also allows for this bishop to not come to g8 anymore. So after the rook up here to g8, we now see an exchange of the bishop and the knight, and then we see the rook come back here to h5. So Magnus Carlsen still wants to play for the win, so he brings his rook back here to h5, and then all of a sudden we see a very interesting move from Vishy Anand. He decides to go ahead and exchange off his minor piece, his last minor piece, his bishop here on g4, in exchange for two pawns. So all of a sudden, Magnus Carlsen has the lead in material. He has a rook and a knight and two pawns, and his opponent has a rook and four pawns. So he's up a pawn in material. The problem for Magnus Carlsen is, although he's kind of up in material, it's very hard to turn this into a win, because he really wants one of his pawns to promote. You know, these rooks kind of cancel each other out. You can't just win with a knight. That's not going to get the job done. You need more material than a knight. That's a draw game. So he needs to find a way. If Vishy Anand can go ahead and take off these pawns, then all of a sudden Magnus Carlsen has lost pretty much all opportunity to win the game. Vishy Anand, on the other hand, he could try for even pushing for a win himself. He has all these pawns over here. If all of a sudden, Magnus Carlsen can't really utilize his knight enough, Vishy Anand has more pawns. He can push forward on the queen side, go ahead and promote one of those to a queen, and easily win this game. So both sides getting into potentially long in-game and just trying to see if their opponents make a mistake. Now, up until this point, 34 moves into the game, about 2.5 hours have gone by. Now, some of the other games have lasted even 2.5 hours, so this is about the stopping point that some of the matches go to, but this game would not be over for a while. We now see pawn here to b6, just solidifying this pawn chain right here. Knight to e4, and we just see a lot of different moves. Again, Magnus Carlsen's goal is to try to make sure his king's safe, try to make sure he doesn't lose any pawns, try to make sure his rook is very centralized, it controls a lot of the board, and then just dance his knight all over the board. Hopefully he can catch his opponent off guard. Maybe he can snipe a few pawns here and there. If he's lucky, fall for a huge mistake, and then all of a sudden he can get a rook. Again, on Vishy Anand's side of the board, he's trying to gobble up these pawns right here. He's trying to make sure that his pawn chain is solidified. His king's not out in the open. He's not getting too attacked. And his rook just kind of swings back and forth, attacking the king, making sure that Magnus Carlsen doesn't do too much. So, pawn here to d7, king to d2. So we kind of come through. Kind of rush through these moves. There are a lot of them, and they're just small incremental moves, not too much to talk about, as we do see some checks and then all of a sudden some incremental moves every now and then. We'll see a lot of knight moves to the center of the board, and then just this rook coming back here on the e-file, every now and then a check. And then every once in a while, we'll actually see a pawn move up the board, which is a little bit what Magnus Carlsen is trying to do. So we'll come through a little bit more. All of a sudden, the rook over on the f-file. Magnus Carlsen's okay to exchange the rooks off the board. If he has 2 pawns and a knight, that's definitely going to be a good endgame for him. Vishy Anand does not want to do that, and so Magnus Carlsen's doing what he needs to do. He's starting to slowly put pressure on his opponent. He recognizes that he's playing an older challenger. Vishy Anand is not quite twice his age, but about 20 years his senior, and so he just wants to try to go to a long end game, drag this out. Even if he doesn't win this game, he recognizes that this could put pressure on his opponent to make mistakes in future games because he wasted so much energy on this game. Vishy Anand, on the other hand, is very good at defending, and he's just trying to hold on, make sure he doesn't make another mistake. The last thing he wants to do is go down 2 games in this series. Pawn here to b5, trying to exchange some of this material off the board. Again, Vishy Anand just wants to get those pawns off the board. Knight to c3, pawn c6, moving the knights, trying to do anything possible with this knight on board, trying to gobble up some material. Vishy Anand just going to dance this king all over the board. We do see an exchange, so that's kind of a minor win for Vishy Anand, taking off one of the pawns. Magnus Carlsen's able to gobble up a pawn himself. And then all of a sudden, as we come through, we do see a check, and now the king comes down and takes this pawn here on b3. So if we kind of look at this setup, we are quite a few moves in. We're 77 moves in. All of a sudden, Magnus Carlsen, he doesn't have any more pawns. And so if you kind of look at this, you say, yes, Magnus Carlsen is up in material because a knight is worth more than 2 pawns, but it's very difficult for Magnus Carlsen or anyone else to translate this into a win because you just don't have the material you need, even though it is better than what your opponent has. Now, Vishy Anand on the other side, he could try to push forward with his pawns. It's going to be very, very difficult. You can't really control everything with just a rook when your opponent has a knight that can dance all over the board and also has a rook. So definitely looking like a drawish game, but both sides decide that they want to go ahead and play it out. So the rook over here to a1 decides to go ahead and just concede one of his pawns after a few moves. So a few checks. We see the rook over here to h1. And now we see the king come over here to d1, centralizing a little bit more, moving around the board. This pawn on here to a3 could be potentially dangerous, but there's no real way to hold on to it. Again, the rook over here on h4, pretty much a barrier for this king. It can't come past this 4th rank anymore, so there's no way to really hold on to this material right here. So after pawn here to a2, we do see an exchange right here. So Vishy Anand, his chances of winning are definitely going very, very slim right now. Magnus Carlsen, a few moves later, is able to gobble up the last pawn on board. And so we see a typical rook in knights versus rook in game. Very, very drawish in nature. Yes, a grandmaster has beaten a grandmaster in this, but it really just requires a huge mistake. So as long as Anand doesn't make a huge mistake, at the end of this we'll have a draw. So we do see many more moves. Again, this was actually one of the longest games in history. It was 2 moves away from the longest game in World Championship history. But after a few more moves in the game, we actually do see an exchange of the rooks here on c1, and after the knight takes here on c1, the players agreed to draw. There's not sufficient material for white to win here, even though white is up in material. And so if you were to run it through a computer, the computer would say, yes, white is definitely winning. White can't win in this position. So this was a very long game. It ended up being 6.5 hours. So, you know, after that 34 move where you kind of looked at it and said, okay, this is probably going to be a draw, that was 2.5 hours. They played for 4 more hours. So Magnus Carlsen, again, I'm not even sure if he wanted, or obviously he wanted to win, but I'm not even sure he thought that he could win. I think deep down he just wanted to try to wear out his opponent for future games. He recognizes that he's up a game and it's going to be difficult for his opponent to actually come back from that deficit. So if he can wear him out right now going into a long endgame, which he kind of knew this would, that's what happened. So 122 moves, 2 shy of the record. We do have a draw. Magnus Carlsen after game 7 is still up a game. And we'll have Anand coming back tomorrow with the white pieces and see if he can come back and even things up. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, are enjoying the matches so far. Definitely a long one, but very, very fun to watch both players playing till the very bitter end. So thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.